I've been tempted to do this video considering a series of calls and emails I've been getting for the past 3 to 4 days when the national grid collapsed within the country, Nigeria. My name is Darlington Okoka, and I wish to welcome you to Delwit Electrical YouTube channel. Today, we shall be discussing on the collapse of the Nigerian National Grid. We have to take into consideration the collapse of the national grid, the causes or reasons why the national grid got collapsed, and the recommendations to avert future collapse within the country. Now, this is not the first collapse that has happened within this year. I believe this particular collapse in February 14 during the Valentine's Day, we had a national collapse, and the publicity was not as massive as it is today. So I believe it's because of the economic situation ravaging the country currently, where the fuel scarcity, the diesel scarcity, all this hardship within the country made the publicity of this total breakdown or total collapse to get a wide media coverage. So let's see what are the major causes of this national grid collapse, or what the national grid is, before we talk about the reasons why it happened. Now, in the national grid is the coalition of all the transmission lines or transmission systems within a power network. So in Nigeria, as we know, all the coordination of the transmission is done at the National Control Center at Osogbo. So all generating stations are mandated to take their power to the national grid. The Transmission Company of Nigeria, through their transmission network, transmits to the various distribution stations. From the distribution stations, it now comes down to the consumers. So if in Nigeria, if the if the transmission network is not efficient, definitely you will see that there is low turnout within the distribution network. So, but sometime earlier last week, the National Assembly have passed a law to ensure that states can transmit, generate, and distribute. So we pray that when the president assent to this bill, we will start seeing states doing their own transmission, generation, and distribution. These are the three key important areas in the national grid. So let's take a look at why we have a collapse of our national grid. Now, the generating stations, either the hydro, the thermal, irrespective of the power you have a fuel source. For the hydro, head of water. For most of the turbines, we have the thermal turbines, we have gas supply. So when we don't have adequate gas supplies to power these generating stations, obviously there will be no power supply to the national grid, and that will lead to a collapse, because when there is no power supply, obviously there will be no supply given. So when there's inadequate supply to the national grid, it gives, if the inadequate supply of fuel, it gives a breakdown to the national grid. Secondly, the major transmission lines, if there's a cut in any of the major transmission line that supplies from the generating station, then obviously there will be a collapse of the national grid. That is why it's very, very necessary that there is a security along our major transmission line, because those transmission line being coordinated at the National Control Center, once you are generating power and it's going towards the transmission line, if any of the major transmission line gets cut off, automatically it will lead to a national breakdown. Then thirdly, obsolete equipment can also lead to a major breakdown. For example, if you look at most of our transmission lines, they are sagging, the cables are beyond their lifespans, the towers are almost gone. So all this, when any of them gets collapsed, it might eventually lead to a shortage in supply, which eventually might lead to a collapse of the grid. Now, natural disasters. In Nigeria, we hardly have major natural disasters like the tsunami, earthquake, and flood. But these are reasons where we can have a national collapse. The last one will be loading the transmission network above its rated capacity. When the transmission line is overloaded, definitely it will lead to a sudden collapse of the line, and that will lead to the collapse of the entire grid. So it's advisable that you don't overload your transmission network. So let's take a couple distance to what happened on February 14th. Now we've listened to the national electric supply industry, we've listened to the National Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission and the Honorable Minister of Power. They've all given five major reasons that caused the collapse, which is left for you and I to analyze and see if that could lead to a major national collapse. First of all, they attributed the cause to technical and supply limitations within the generating stations. So I think three of them attributed that to it. They also attributed it to low gas supply as a result of vandalization of the pipelines, which obviously, if that actually happens, it can also lead to a collapse of the national grid. They also said that there was a dip in the dip in hydroelectric power supply as a result of low pressure. So we all know that the head of water is quite low now. So that could also lead, because Kanja and Shiroro now might not be generating up to adequate capacity. So it could also lead to a collapse of the national grid. Now, considering these technical and supply failures within the line, they also carried out a routine maintenance of most of their stations that coincidentally happened during this incident. So whenever they're carrying out a routine maintenance, the generating stations are always usually down. So unfortunately, when they were carrying out this routine maintenance, that is when this technical supply affected some other generating stations, and that led to a major breakdown in supply. And finally, they also told us that three major generating stations were down. The Calabar, the Afam 6, Calabar Afam 6 and Okpai. These three generating stations were down, and that led to a massive drop on the generating station, which led to a collapse of the grid. So those are the reasons that were given to us and that led to a breakdown. And as we know, for a, for a generating station to have adequate stability on the transmission line, there have to be a constant, the rated capacity in terms of power, in terms of voltage, in terms of current, and in terms of frequency has to be, there have to be a stability. When there's an unstable balance, can also lead to a collapse of the grid. So I think are veritable reasons why we have this February 14th collapse, this February 14th and March 14th and 15th collapse. Now let's take a look about the history of major national collapse we have in the country. Having taken a look at the NEC, NESI, and the TCN website, there are no verifiable data that gives the collapse, registered collapse within the country. But Ripple Nigeria, they've been able to analyze from 2010 to 2021. In 2010, we have like 42 collapses in the country, and in 2021, we had four. And along the line, we have 24, 25. It's shown on the screen. It will be displayed. The table is displayed on your screen. So if you do the calculation from 2010 to 2021, we've had a total of 215 collapses within the country, which is enormous. And in 2022 already, we're having, in February 14th, we had one, and in March 14th, 15th, we had three. So a total of 218 collapses since 2010 to date. So that's enormous. And we need to ensure that it doesn't give the country a good light. So we need to ensure to way or provide means by which these collapses can be reduced to the barest minimum. Now, considering these major lapses we have in our national grid network, I would like to prefer some kind of recommendations to the federal government through the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission and other regulatory agencies within the power sector network. The first on my list will be the decentralization of the grid network. We have 6 geopolitical zones, and it would have been very necessary whereby we have 6 different grid networks, so that when a particular grid is down, others can also have power while maintenance is being carried, instead of having a national blackout. All right, lest I forget, there are two types of collapses. We have the partial collapse and we have the total collapse. Partial collapse occurs when a particular section of the grid breaks down. In that case, it's not the entire national grid that breaks down. So that section that breaks down, there will be blackout within that section. So that's why sometimes you see that a particular state that is affected by the injection substation that breaks down, that state will be in blackout, while other states will have power. But when we have the total collapse, it means that the entire network is down. And when the entire network is down, the entire country will be filled with blackout for that is the total collapse that happens in the country. So the second recommendation we're going to be talking about is efficient transmission network. If you are traveling within the country, you see our 330 kV lines, you will notice that the lines are weak. And in that case, the towers carrying them to are also weak. That's to show that the weakness of the transmission line from time to time might lead to a collapse. So it's recommended that we have an efficient transmission lines. All those weak lines should be reinforced to ensure that no collapse happens within the country. The third one is SCADA system and online digital control. We have what we call the supervisory control and data acquisition. This is very necessary in every distribution network. In Because when you have that, you can on real time tell which of the particular section is having issues, and you could run down immediately to ensure that it's being averted. And the fourth one is the supply of gas. Now, when we supply gas, gas is one of the major reasons whereby we have for our generation station like the Tama, gas is the major means of supply. But we've experienced several vandalization of this gas pipeline, and this is not good for our system. So they should try as much as possible to ensure that within this gas line there's adequate securities to make sure that the pipelines are not vandalized. Now, the last on our list is when you see the transmission and distribution, there's an interjection, and there's no adequate protection at this interjection, which is very bad. Because if there's no protection, whenever there's a fault coming from the transmission system, automatically it affects the distribution system. So there should be an improvement in this interjection. If you look at the statistics properly, worldwide, it's 60% of most failures we have is at this interjection point. So there have to be adequate protection at this interjection point to ensure that our lines are effectively carried out. Then the rated capacity. Let us try as much as possible not to overload our transmission and distribution network, because when it's overloaded above its capacity, it will lead to a collapse of the national grid. I believe I've been able to explain to you in details what the national collapse is, national grid collapse is, what the national grid is, what collapse is, and how we can avert it. And I believe if we are able to follow meticulously these recommendations, future national grid collapse will be averted. If this video has been very educative to you, kindly click on the subscription icon to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click on the notification icon so as to get notified when subsequent videos are being posted. Thank you for tuning to Delwit YouTube channel.